Hello, and welcome to the Varn blog. And today we're here with Jimmy Merchant, author of In-Game Economic Nationalism and Global Decline, which was published last year, and author of 3 different articles, one in the Baffler, one in Heatwave, and the most recent one, which kind of ties them together in my mind, in Brooklyn Rail, about the Trump administration. I am normally hesitant to do Trump administration stuff, not because I don't think it's important and not because I'm afraid of it, but because most people focus on superficial short-term analysis and see Trump as a sui generis phenomenon. And even if he is because this is a regime, not just a person, is something new, we have to ask ourselves a few questions about how it emerges out of the old and not just freak out about what is going on right now. And I also think a lot of people get caught up in the what the fuck is he doing todayness of it all, which creates a way in which people will talk about what's going on in your home state one day, and then the next day talk about the big golden ballroom, and then the next day talk about whatever's going on with Pam Bondi or whatever, but then not put it together in any long trajectory trends or anything at all. And then something fascism, which is a pretty useless analysis, even when it's correct. So all that aside, why did you start writing about this? You know, I don't associate with this kind of commentary on Trump with your tendency of communist politics.
You mean you're sort of like why go in on Trump and sort of analytically?
Right. Why use Trump as an analytic locus, since it's usually, as we said, a locus of misunderstanding, not understanding?
Yeah. I mean, certainly like the way that it gets, the whole phenomenon of Trump the figure and Trumpism the movement gets taken up in the media and online, like for the most part, is way overdetermined by by the kind of wild like media ecosystem in which we live, and the way that, you know, the technologies that we interact with every day, and the algorithms that like are programming us now on a daily level, are now trying to wind up these like really emotionally intensive responses intentionally on the part of users and viewers and so on. And so it gets in the sort of daily discussion of, I guess, like the regime, right? It gets caught up in that environment, like really chaotically. But it's at the same time, it's just what is on everyone's mind. It just dominates the discussion, you know, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. It's like politics has just taken over everything. You know, it has taken over entertainment and pop culture and education and like almost every other domain of life in like civil society that we can name. And it's just that, I guess, that conviction that it's like it's so front and center in our consciousness that it needs to be, like, I guess, demystified in a certain way and taken out and seen, and kind of like what you were saying at the start, like placed against that historical, like the canvas of that historical backdrop, and you know, so that we can begin to offer explanations for how did we get here, you know, like the present as history, which is really kind of my thing, is like understanding the present as history, to sum up kind of what all my writing is about. And yeah, and just compounded and made more urgent by what specifically, you know, what's happening in cities across the country, but you know, being in Chicago right now, it's really top of mind. Trying to figure out what's going on with this regime and with the political currents right now. So that's, I guess, that's what motivated me to dig into it more analytically, I would say, if that makes sense.
Right. That makes total sense. I've actually really appreciated your work, because I've been looking for a way to start explaining what we see in Trump 2 versus Trump 1 beyond like obvious superficial things like Ivanka isn't there and the mediating forces of society have been fairly atomized, etc., etc. But I started thinking about, like, well, how do you explain that the mediating forces of society were fertily atomized when the essential mainstream of economic management and the Democratic Party was in charge for the prior 4 years and could not restore any of it, apparently?
Yeah.
And which does really put a hamper on a lot of people's political hopes for the immediate future, even if you didn't assume that the Democrats would just be weak tea. I think one thing I have to ask you is why aren't people asking, not that the Democrats won't do anything, but why they can't beyond political will? Because this doesn't seem to be on the table for a lot of people. They cannot imagine that this is not just a problem of cynicism, which, it probably is there too. This is not me to take that away. I don't want to take the blame off the Democrats, but like, what? Why can't they even look at that at the moment? What do you think that is?
I mean, I think that the the Democrats are. I mean, there's multiple things going on as always, right? But
Mm.
one dynamic that I've been short tracking in my recent work is how the shifting class fractions of the American ruling class
Mhm.
and the investor class are playing out within the regime, and then within the so-called loyal opposition, as it were, the Democratic Party, and like what's kind of shifting behind the scenes of the two parties. And I mean, we can definitely get into this in more detail if you want, but Trump, I believe, Trumpism, the current regime, Trump 2, represents a kind of insurgency from within the capitalist class on the part of not just Silicon Valley tech billionaires, although they're among the most important, but also like private equity capitalists, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, owners of controlling stakes in publicly traded companies, like these kind of like petty private capitalists, right? Who aren't like the old school, like our kind of older notion of the responsible capitalist manager of a publicly traded company, like massive corporation, nor are they like the CEO of like a very widely distributed publicly traded corporation in the kind of classic neoliberal sense of like, we're going to spread share ownership right across as wide a base as possible and democratize, so-called, quote unquote, democratize the economy. But are increasingly these like tightly controlling, sometimes very family oriented capitalists who share Trump's outlook in the world and share his contempt for the norms of the political system and like the kind of legality of the economic order as we've inherited it, and are perfectly happy to support him in his like campaigns to wreck it, And I mean, I'm talking, these are people like, obviously Mark Andreessen, Musk, despite their falling out, they share a lot of the same goals. Bill Ackman, another figure I've written about, private equity guy, very on board with Trump's whole agenda and kind of shares a lot of his worldview, I think. And it's kind of figures like these, I think, that are powering the insurgency within the Republican side of the ruling class, and really are a lot of the capital support base for Trump's project. And so that leaves a lot of the other powerful like capitalist interests kind of frozen out. And we can get into more about like who those are, but I think a lot of those interests are the corporations, the fund managers, and the kind of figures who worked hand in glove with the Democrats, throughout the 2010s. I'm thinking of people like Larry Fink of BlackRock, for example, and the JP, the Jamie Dimons of the world, right? Like the investment bank CEOs, like these are the kind of fractions of finance capital that worked very closely with the Democrats and formed and cultivated very close relationships with that party, but now have been kind of frozen out of the current kind of, the favor of the current regime, which is more on the side of the kind of insurgent private finance that I was describing earlier, or supported by it. And they hold a lot of assets that like the Bill Ackmans of the world want to get their hands on, right? Like billions and billions of dollars of like private retirement funds, pension funds, right, that are still managed by the big asset managers. The private fund managers want their hands on that cash pile, and so Trump is part of that project to try to raid that. And so I think the more that the Trumpist project like radicalizes, the more it's pushing the kind of establishment, like status quo anti, like what we used to call neoliberal capitalist interests, more forcefully into the Democratic Party side, and is making kind of appeasing them and like catering to their desire to want to get back to a more stable, less erratic order of things. It's making that appeal on the part of the Democrats more and more appealing. And so as a result, I think that it's that desire on the part of that older fraction of the capitalist class for normality, for some kind of return to normality, and the Democrats' like kind of willingness to see that as their ticket back to power is a big thing, is a big factor in what's like leading to the political paralysis of the Democrats, right? Like they don't see any self-interest in taking a more radical stand against Trumpism, or in building stronger like connections with the base, or capitalizing on the rage and the hatred, right, for what's happening right now on the part of many liberals, right? Like people we would call normies, who are beside themselves, right, just livid with anger. The Democratic Party is not interested in capitalizing on any of that, really. They're not trying to oppose the regime in any kind of effective way, I think in large part because they're trying to triangulate with the very powerful business forces, right, that are still kind of in their corner and aren't interested in any kind of like powerful like response like that. And so, I mean, we could go back to the Biden years, right? And I mean, it was, he was cutting with like the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act and all of Bidenomics. I mean, he was cutting these deals through the asset managers, right, and through the big banks. Like they were helping the administration like manage and organize these deals, and as kind of like financial engineering to make them happen. And so we can go back and we can talk more about the background and all this, but like long story short, that's what I see as like a big factor in what's preventing structurally. Right.
Yeah, structurally. I want to talk about three things that aren't in your analysis that I think are not there, not because you're missing them, but because they're misguided. One, private equity is still a form of finance capital. So despite what people thought, this is not finance capital versus traditional manufacturing. I don't think it ever has been, actually, but it definitely can't even wear that facade very well right now. Despite the quote Mar-a-Lago Accord notion of manufacturing and the tariff stuff, if you look at what they're doing, it's decreased manufacturing. Any idiot would have figured out that it would, because it makes manufacturing conditions unstable, and input output costs are going to mean that no one's going to invest in traditional manufacturing that way. Phil Neal's work also makes it very clear that it just wouldn't do what they're saying it would do anyway, and they must know that. Like I'm going to use some really annoyingly technical Marxist jargon, but the organic composition of fixed capital is so high that socially necessary labor time is really low, And even if I build mass factories, it's not going to create a lot of jobs. And we see this in the developing world. Even people taking, Chinese development in Africa are not getting the jobs payoff that you would have gotten even 20 years ago, which has also led to a misconception of people seeing China as like this, traditionalist manufacturing hub, of which it is and isn't simultaneously, because it has the same organic composition issues that everyone else does. Thus, it has high youth unemployment, supposedly communist country. So that's something that's also kind of missing. So this is an internal to, if you think finance capital is the big problem, this is actually a competition between different kinds of finance capital. So that's one thing to point out. Another thing to point out, and I do want, maybe this is something that I do think is missing, but I do want to talk to you a little bit about it, is there does seem to be a real populist insurgency, and I put that in quotation marks, in a faction of the Democrats that does seem to have massive amounts of consulting money now. If you look at the stuff around Bernie Sanders, there's money there. There's real money there. Millions of dollars are flowing through consulting firms that came out of our revolution. But it also seems to not be able to do much to counter signal here because, for example, Sanders is going on conservative shows and talking about Trump's closed borders and border stuff in a way that sounds like a 12-year-old, honestly. And yes, he's always believed in relative immigration controls and all that, but talking about Trump versus Biden as if Biden didn't have really strong immigration controls is really fucking funny.
Yeah.
And he knows better. So why do you think this kind of opposition that a whole lot of people who speak for the left, and that's also in scare quotes for people listening, are buying into, even defending, weird former mercenaries in Maine? Why is that? Still, whose interest is that in? Because I do think there has to be some interest within the party that sees this as a way to get some of that progressive function back in without doing much. And I think because it's a prior example of candidates like this that were supported by Sanders were people like John Fetterman, who are not supported by Sanders, but about a decade prior, people like Kristen Sinema, which then actually reinforces, weirdly, the standard mainstream Democrat view, even to these progressives who are very pissed off that they aren't doing anything, that the insurgents are actually just right-wingers in disguise anyway. What do you think the basis for that is? Because I do think we have to figure that out, because that's the only place where there even is the illusion of dynamicism in the Democratic Party right now. But a lot of people that I respect seem to be fooled by it? Question mark?
Yeah, kind of like why people are either being fooled by it or in any case showing support for an agenda like Sanders, coming out and saying something we need to be serious about border security and Trump is doing it well, but still taking a kind of left populist view of things. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, and the same people that kick people out of the movement, like Angela Nagel, a few years back for saying basically the same thing. Now they're like, oh, but Bernie's always said this and we stand behind them. But I'm not so interested in the left logic of that. It's dumb, but that's not my point. I'm more interested in why would there be millions of dollars being funneled for ad campaigns and whatnot into this within the party if there wasn't some faction of capital thinking that was necessary. I'm not saying they believe in its agenda.
Well, yeah. I do think there's probably a large constituency behind, in the money backing up behind the Democratic Party right now, that I think is just they've maybe concluded that they've read the tea leaves or seen the writing on the wall, or pick your metaphor, but the world of globalization is is gone, is increasingly, I mean, the global economy is still obviously integrated globally, like economically, like that's not over, but like the former ideology, right, that like linked a lot of the corporate world together and the political class on both sides of the spectrum as a narrative that made sense about the world, that is the classic globalization narrative of yesteryear, it no longer is meaningful, and or they're not buying it. And I think that like a lot, probably the factions of capital who are behind the Democratic Party have increasingly just come to kind of accept that reality, and are just like, okay, we're in a world now that is going to be increasingly nationalistic and border crazed, and we're going to have to make compromises, because a large part of that big business coalition, it was always divided on immigration stuff, for example, right? Like there was always like for a very long time, there was always like a pretty strong corporate lobby for immigration reform, meaning like not an extremely harsh border security policy, and because they need undocumented labor to survive and to remain profitable in a lot of sectors. But I think they're increasingly recognizing that like the winds are shifting, and Trumpism is like driving this, right? Like as a project, that's like the weird the weird sense in which Trumpism is both like backward looking and nostalgic, but also really generative and like future oriented in the way that it's barreling the country, indeed the world, forward in this increasingly atavistic direction, but reshifting and reforming all these different class and political alliances that our generation grew up kind of taking for granted. So I think that there's been kind of an acceptance of that, this new world, where this new, darker and more violent and border obsessed world that we're moving into, even by factions of the otherwise like more cosmopolitan or international minded ruling class, and that includes part of the Democratic base as well, a Democratic financial base as well. And yeah, I mean, that's one way I think of making a cut and sort of getting at your question. But that gets beyond like, kind of like, I guess we could get into ideological discussions about what is changing, within like the media institutions, and how they are taking they're also following in this trend, and just framing everything in a much more like straightforwardly Trumpist way. Even the so-called liberal media, like the CNNs and MSNBCs of the world. Not that that many people watch it anymore, but they increasingly just take Trump's rhetoric and his framing at face value when they're talking about stuff, right? And that's a difference between now and Trump 1 that I think is pretty important. But yeah, just the liberal institutions in general, man, are like, they're increasingly just sort of speaking in Trumpist light terms.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it.
My take on the Biden administration, and we can turn into the media in a second, but that it did function to normalize and make large sectors of more traditional capitalists. By traditional, actually, I only mean back into the 1980s. We're not talking about Fordism or anything. Traditional capitalist functionaries happy by rationalizing and humanizing prior Trumpist policies from these various insurgencies. One thing I do want to get into, though, that I find interesting here, because I don't think this is about the Trump won the popular election, so we all just have to back down narrative, because I'm like, yes, he barely won it. Everybody's barely won it since like Obama won since 2008, and even then that wasn't as overwhelming as you would have thought it would have been, given how unpopular Bush was in 2007. I mean, you were talking about a president who left office with like a 20%, 25% approval rate or something, like terrible. But who was popular for most of his presidency, kind of. The Obama, shift was a clearer win than Trump's, but both were relatively narrow for historical norms in the United States. So I don't really think that's what did it. I know a lot of people do. I'm not saying it's not a factor. What I think is, and this comes up in your book on Endgame about economic nationalism. I mean, we are seeing a return of economic nationalism that was driven by stuff far before Trump. I mean, like Trump as a figure, if we think about this kind of figure, actually comes rather late. The US resisted this for longer than parts of Europe and parts of the periphery in Asia. And while I don't really think you can classify Russia and China as the same phenomenon, they are tied into similar market phenomenons. And I think Mike Davis is like, deathbed call of doom. Like, I mean, I was just, I have read that Thanos piece at Sidecar like multiple times, and I'm like, man, he called it. And oh my God.
It's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think people realize how dark it was. I was just like, he's basically like, I mean, it's not like you've lost, but it's pretty close to that. And there are no good guys on the horizon, but a lot of you are going to think there are.
Yeah, it's bleak. It's bleak.
But that aside, I mean, like, let's try to contextualize this. But first, by talking about this ideological shift, and then I want to go international because I do think there's a tendency right now to be entirely state focused because there is a tendency on all sides to double down on nationalism at a time when state capacity seems way weaker than it's ever been. Or not
Absolutely.
ever been, but at least the last 150 years.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this and what you're saying. Like, why are liberals dying on this narrative? Like I try to listen to liberal stuff all the time and get into their progressive outrage, and I follow the scandals of who's funding who and blah blah blah, and I'll even listen to the abundance and chorus people and all that because I need to know what liberals think, right? And I've noticed that like increasingly, if you listen to MS Now, aka MSNBC, you still have Rachel Maddow, but Rachel Maddow is no longer doing the conspiracy shit that she was doing. There isn't the focus on identity politics at all, even though there are plenty of people who are pretending that this is still somehow a major issue on the liberal left. It is in universities, but universities are archaic institutions that take decades to change. So, like,
and they're also trying to stamp it out.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Right. I was about to say, with the help of government, like we have so many English and sociology departments that are basically in receivership right now in my state at public schools, and people are very focused on Harvard or whatever, so they're not noticing this happening.
Absolutely,
and the states have been able to justify it because enrollment's down. Too, I mean, because people don't see it as a valid, a very good risk on investment. I don't know if that's entirely true yet, but I get where they're coming from. I guess to get back to this, what do we mean by the media now? Because I think people don't think of social media companies as media companies, and I really think they should. And two, what have you seen as like I listed, like I mentioned with MSNBC, they have a bunch of old neocons on who will even like plays Mandani sometimes, but are more or less still, they still have a national conservative outlook. They're just opposed to the people who call themselves national conservatives. And that's becoming the main of the Democratic Party resistance. So what does that mean, and why is that happening?
Well, I think the legacy media, right, like the CNNs and the MSNBCs of the world, even the Fox the Foxes of the world, although just keeping it, confining ourselves just to kind of the liberal outlets, like it's the media, the information system, the public information system has always been a privately owned enterprise, subject to capitalist imperatives. And I mean, we can go all the way back to like the beginnings of the commercial newspapers in this country, and the way that those were the first commercially viable mass media in like that began around kind of like the 1830s, 1840s, like antebellum era. And were able to break away from the more kind of like government controlled like newspapers and pamphlets of the time, which were the dominant media of the time, through the capitalist model, through a profit-driven model of expansion. And in the U.S. context, right, that took on like as the news media, as the capitalist news media grew into one of the main pillars of liberal society and government, they developed this kind of in-house ideology, right? That was kind of like empiricist and positivist, but let's put it this way: it was like an empiricist version of impartiality, right? Like, we're just going to report the facts. We're not going to be partisan. We're not going to be ideological. Although, of course, empiricism and positivism is deeply ideological, but they weren't operating on that level. And that became the kind of house ideology of journalism, of news, of the news institutions in this country, right? Mm-hmm. And that whole, that paradigm sort of held, through the late 19th century up through the 20th century, through the era of the great newspapers, through the era of the television, the coming of TV. And then even in the early years of the internet, that professionalized sense of journalism and of news as a public service, right? That even though it's capitalist, even though it's a business, it has a public obligation, to get something right about the world, was still very strong. But over the last 20 or so years, under the pressures of profit crises and corporate consolidation, and the need to find a new business model, and then the coming, of course, of social media, which is a whole other kind of whole other level of monopolized private ownership, that now is increasingly driven by right-wing fanaticism, right? Especially in the case of something like Twitter, which has been transformed into just basically like a Nazi chat forum. That's barely an exaggeration. And so just the information environment under the pressures of this rapid technological change and crises of profitability and business viability has just been degraded so dramatically that now and taken over by the algorithm, or the technology that we call the algorithm, which, like I was saying earlier, kind of trades in histrionic, queuing up histrionic responses in the way that is most likely to gin up more clicks and more ad revenue. And it's kind of like this unholy marriage of these different economic, technological, and cultural factors coming together, that has just totally degraded and destroyed the information environment. To the point that the news institutions, they don't really care about that old ideal of impartiality, of objectivity and reporting, of keeping things non-ideological. They're openly partisan, right? And so, I think that's happening. That's happening on both sides of the spectrum, so to speak. And I think it's contributing to a broader breakdown of liberalism as a coherent philosophy and intellectual outlook in the world. Basically, they have no more. They don't really have a strong intellectual basis to criticize Trumpism anymore, as part of why they don't have any sort of strong intellectual or basis in conviction to criticize Trumpism anymore, because central institutions like the news media have essentially just collapsed as functional, information providers and recyclers of information for the public. And so as the public is degraded, right, like intellectually and ideologically, the institutions begin to reflect that and begin to just give back to them this more like raw and unprocessed and emotionally charged kind of messaging in place of the old model. And so that went further back in sort of history than I originally intended, but that's part of how I understand the long breakdown of the public information environment in this country, and how it's feeding it's such a huge part of what is making Trumpism so effective as a political movement. Is this transformation in the form of how people consume information. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think this is liberals talk about this, about like the conservative takeover of like TikTok and Instagram and Twitter being obvious. But I also think Bluesky is interesting too, because it caters to people who like to pretend we're somehow in the eternal spring of 2016. I think you're dead on here, and I've actually thought a lot about this. One of the things I've noticed is that the turn towards sort of, for lack of a better term, I'm going to not be particularly Marxist in my phrasing here, but highly emotivist forms of social justice with vague identity categories that we often call woke, which dealt with, and I want to also be clear, some very real concerns. I am not saying this was all manufactured, but drove a lot of the response to the partisanization of conservative media, which was driven largely by certain kinds of business interests that used to be more like the Koch brothers and Sunbelt development, which you saw a little bit more in the first Trump coalition than you do now. And I found that people didn't contextualize that with any materialist analysis, that they just, wokeism was a problem that emerged from the universities, right? But no, there was no real explaining why did the New York Times ever fuck with that shit in the first place, and why did it become so dominant? And one, I don't know how much stock you put into this, but I am a believer in the overproduction of elites, and it's not something that is strictly speaking from Marxism, but I do think that's part of it. But the other part is they needed a way to capture certain audiences and build in what we might call collective action problems for audiences to leave. Because if you made it like you were signaling a social allegiance change, it made changing your reading habits a seemingly political act. And this goes back to something you said earlier. Politics is everywhere right now. It's first and foremost on every part of society. And yet, I'm just going to say it, we have less effect over politics than we ever fucking had. I mean, not ever, but like since liberal democracy probably developed and had full enfranchisement. And I find that like fascinating. So people are confronted with politics all the time and think they're involved in it, but can't really actually do much because they can't materially contribute that much. Or if they do so in such aggregate, like they did with the Obama or the Bernie Sanders campaign, where you might help people raise millions of dollars, but you have no say over where that goes or how it's used or if it's even used to fucking elect the candidates you want elected. And no, people are like, oh, well, it's not making AOC or Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris or who the fuck ever rich. And I'm like, no, but it's going into a massive consulting infrastructure that is making people rich, just probably not the candidates. I say this because all this to me seems tied together in a general, crisis of these forms of capital. Because honestly, it doesn't make that much sense that media ownership was ever profitable. as a commodity, it's easily reproduced. I mean, particularly now as a physical commodity, it's. It was actually studying the media that got me to believe that there was something to labor theory of value, which I think people will find surprising because many Marxist, in quotations, scholars will do this and they become like Jody Dean and talk about how labor theory of value is just not operable and whatever. And then they go off on some tangent and end up talking about how we're in feudalism or whatever.
Right.
but I looked at it and goes, oh, look, no, the labor cost for newspapers and other forms of media, magazines, etc., books have gone down. As those labor costs have gone down, there's been intensification of organic capital, socially necessary labor time drops. And I hate to tell you, but without rents, they're not profitable. Just flat out. If you go, I mean, I am contracted to write a book. You write a book. You've written a book. I used to work for Zero Books, so I know the publishing model. Do you have any idea how little money fucking publishing companies make? It's pathetic. Like
that was my assumption. Yeah.
Right. And it's basically kept afloat because of academic and or social control reasons, if I'm completely honest. Like it's a form of social reproduction management, effectively. And it's not really that expensive to do anymore, so why not? But it's not a profitable business at scale. Anything like, even people who talk about things like, I don't know, the role-playing book industry or something that's completely frivolous but might be profitable, and that's not about social control. You're still dealing with people who run shops that are way tinier and way more petite bourgeois actually than most people realize, because you just don't need to run big things anymore. But broadcast media is even weirder because, like, I've always been like, that's only been ever profitable because of monopolization. That's the only way that was ever profitable. It's a rent-seeking thing. It's always been a rent-seeking thing since day one. That's actually part of why things like the FCC exist and are able to influence it, because it requires government involvement to be rent-seeking in a way that the traditional, and by this I do mean like 19th century, early modern publishing industry, were actually profitable. That never was going to be the case for broadcast media. And this brings us to the social media. And I guess this brings me to a big question, and then we'll switch to the international outlook. When you talked about the people aligned with Trump and the Democrats, the elephant in the room is the tech giants were very much at the end of Trump 1 on the side of traditional capital and the Democrats, of traditional finance capital and the Democrats. That was clear. Even Musk, and they were always ideological weirdos, people, but that's not the point. They thought it was in their interest to play with the Democratic Party versus whatever old coalition that Trump was putting together, and Trump won. That clearly isn't true now, and they are acting more like private equity venture capital firms. And I guess at first I interpreted it as they wanted to kick the ladder down of competition, which I still think is partly true. That since if you know anything about these companies, like Elon Musk would not be the world's richest person if SpaceX had not gotten a contract from the Obama administration. It's just a flat out proof. Like Tesla didn't do it. Peter Thiel would not be as important as he is if he wasn't peddling his surveillance stuff to states. And there is a way that in which these like seemingly, talk about, I guess we talk about the contradictions of neoliberalism, because seemingly anti-neoliberal in that they're anti-globalization, but pro-neoliberal in that they're pro-private partnerships like crazy, while pretending that they're mostly laissez-faire or whatever. Is an indication of some major shift, but I'll telegraph where I'm going with this and give you a little bit from both in-game and then reading the work of Professor Alami in the Netherlands about state capitalism, which I started getting into when I was reading Brenner and Riley's Bidenism theses, which most of which are wrong except for one thing, that we lived in an area of low profitability, and that low profitability was leading to political decisions actually mattering for economic decisions, and a straight up rents and patronage network, despite the fact that you were hearing everyone say that we were having record profits. And this is why I brought that up in the beginning. So how is that related to why the tech giants, even ones that have, some of them still have vaguely liberal inclinations in the small L sense, why did they all line up and kiss the ring? I mean, like Musk and Thiel, that makes sense both materially and otherwise. But people like Bezos and Zuckerberg are harder to explain.
Yeah, or like Mark Andreessen.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, who definitely, I think, who is certainly in this camp. I think that the Biden administration experience for them was a kind of crucible in certain ways. I think that so it's the end of the pandemic, right? There's a restoration of what seems like, normality at the time. People are breathing a sigh of relief or whatever, and a lot of the capitalist class is sort of, happy to, January 6th happened, whatever, we're putting all that behind us. Just water under the bridge, right? Let's move forward with Sleepy Joe. But I think Silicon Valley has had a series, like a recent history of failed next big things, right? In the early 2010s, it was like the big data revolution, and then it was like Web 3.0 or whatever, and then it's virtual reality, and then it's the metaverse, and then it's crypto, and then it's NFTs, and all of these big things that were supposed to be the next iPhone, right? And just deliver untold expansionary growth that like remakes economic life and social life, right? And creates whole new domains for revenue generation, just did not materialize, right? It was just one failure after another. And of course, we had the big crypto, bust with Sam Bankman-Fried going to jail under Biden's term. And it was also right around then that, of course, the LLMs entered the public discussion, and they decided to make this into the big AI revolution, right? That was going to really be the next big thing for the Valley and for the oligarchs. And so that happened. And also the Silicon Valley Bank breakdown or collapse, I should say, happened. That was huge, right? No one even remembers that now, but that was like an enormous collapse that had most of Silicon Valley wondering how they were going to continue to operate, like after it broke down, because it was so central to the venture capital model that drives the Valley's like ideology and economy. And so they were scared shitless by it. And so AI is in the mix and is being seen as the next big thing. That big bank collapse happens. And also at the same time, though, you have the Biden administration beginning to talk very mildly about like regulating, these new AI technologies and, making them safe to use or whatever. He's still like full speed ahead. We're going to build all the data centers. Like we're going to, be the world leader in this technology. But they're just, the administration is just making these tiny little gestures towards regulation. And that's enough to totally like freak out, right? The venture capital and investor class from the Valley, who increasingly were wanting to put all their chips in this, right? As their big break. And so they were really freaking out about this during the Biden years. And going back to what you were bringing up about the place of so-called woke thinking and all of this, like Mark Andreessen himself has that interview in the New York Times where he's narrating like this really traumatic experience where they were talking about AI and his stupid venture capital firm. And like one of his workers got up and was like, I don't think it's okay how much how much damage this has on the environment, right? Like we shouldn't be pursuing this. Like, this is bad for the planet and for society. And it was like he had, there were across these tech corporations, right? There was like people, like workers were organizing and were speaking out, and were, these are mostly college educated, like professional, like software engineers, programmers, and so on in the tech industry, but they're increasingly becoming sort of class conscious and speaking up about things and confronting, right, these little petty tyrants of, private tech capital. And this was really traumatizing for them, apparently. And I think that is a big factor in what pushed them to the right, was this turbulence among their workers. And again, they're on the record talking about this. And so I think it was a combination. I think it was sort of a combination of those things that pushed them into the Trump camp, in addition to the prospect of also, of course, the new defense startups like Anduril, Palantir, et cetera, kind of really salivating at the prospect of getting plugged directly into the defense budget, right? And Trump's people,
which they have been.
like 100%,
massively.
Yeah, they again, it was about like, Trump is going to let them brush aside the monopoly incumbents, right? Like for them to break in, they had to get like the Lockheeds and the Northrop Grummons, and the Boeings, like kind of to the side, so that they could start distributing the contracts to the newcomers, and that's exactly what they've been doing. And so we could get into how the whole crisis of tech capital is itself a symptom of the declining health and vigor of the capitalist system more broadly, which it is. But speaking locally, that's kind of how I read the Biden years.
So I do want to get into that because I've been baffled by this idea that they're going to bring back high rates of profitability without a massive state, which they are simultaneously gutting. Because reading Alami's work, it seems very clear we're in a period of state capital development, one that we haven't seen since the early 20th century, and at the same time, we do not have the state capacity of the early 20th century, despite all the surveillance stuff and everything like that. One of the things that I've told people about, like, their fears about Trump is, I'm like, Trump might destroy the republic, and liberalism's probably dead anyway, even if he doesn't. But guys, he can't occupy half the country with just ICE or even with the military. Like, they don't have that capacity. They could do it with drones, but then you start getting into, like, you do that and you start provoking I mean, you're talking about some of the richest states in the country and thus some of the richest areas in the world. Just allowing that to happen, I doubt it. So, and also I've read some stuff out of Congress that indicates that they know that. So I've tried to figure out what this is about in a more, as much as I hate populism, and that's a different debate, but because I think it's also a technology of control right now. But just taking a more populist, like, okay, what other functions does this actually serve? Because the whole liberal fear, and maybe even Trump's statement that they're going to deploy the National Guard of all 50 states, and if they do it, and it most likely would lead to a civil war, which would be very bad for all forms of capital, no matter what. Even the venture capitalist firms would have a hard time profiting off of that, because it would basically destroy the dollar. So I have been really trying to figure that part of this out, and what I've figured is this: This does create instability, which allows for more and more of these insurgents to insert themselves and get more and more control of a balkanized internally federal government, even if it does risk the thing that I just said. And the reason why that's important is if you factor out the internal loop of NVIDIA chips and server farming, you have this paradox where the most valued company in the world, OpenAI, is openly unprofitable. But its only way to become profitable is to somehow, now this is also to me a vindication of Marxism and actually confirms some of my doubts about Marxism in the past, believe it or not, somehow bring profitability to the older forms of the economy. That's their promise. That's their eventual payout. Otherwise, they're just sucking. Otherwise, it's just a massive wealth transfer that eventually will have to stop. And if you take out the NVIDIA server farm builds and the power energy usage related to that, making energy companies more profitable, what you see is you are in no or negative growth in most of the economy, and you have been since about 2003, and definitely in the last year.
Absolutely, yeah.
And even the purveyors of the bubble are saying it's a bubble. Only people like Derick Thomas over at the Abundance era of the Democrats are trying to like spin this in a way that it isn't. I mean, Sam Freed's kind of admitted it's a bubble. Like,
I know, I was gonna say they have ever fewer. Yeah, they have fewer and fewer like defenders these days. Yeah,
right, including themselves. I mean, just been like, it's been openly like. I mean, when you have Sam Altman saying that we're going to focus on deepfake porn and other things as our means to profitability, I'm like, so you're an addiction mechanism, and that's all you got. Now, I don't mean to tell you that despite what people think about illicit drug use, it's not actually in the broad spectrum super profitable industry. That's why it hasn't been legalized, and its profitability is actually based on it being illegal. But whatever, because constant demand doesn't actually mean what you think it means. And so the reason why I say this vindicates me is because from a Marxist perspective, investments in fixed capital like this will only ever lead to temporary profitability boosts, but then they'll lower the profit bar lower and lower and lower over time as market competition kicks back in. And the only way to offset that is monopsony power, right? Which I think is what people are mistaking for feudalism.
Yeah.
But that involves massive state investment, and basically we have, the oil export war model that you see in parts of the what we might call the semi-developed world. I hate these terms, but Russia, Mexico. Mexico's not on a war model, but it's doing the same thing. Export economies, particularly in raw and unprocessed resources. Mexico is transitioning to a processed resources model, when it has been for the last 20 years, and which may explain some of its own kind of lefty middle century internal dynamics, actually, which would make our left populist friends a little bit uncomfortable, because that's going to imply that's going to end eventually. Then you have the China model, which is intense state involvement, authoritarian, but with some significant social safety net and payoff. But not as generous as even mid-century social democracy in a Nordic country, but it does have that to deal with its lower growth rate, which, the elephant in the room is I just see people promising less and less on the Chinese growth rate and then calling it like super high. And I'm like, yeah, 5% is good, but we were at that 2 years ago. But they still have a very high youth unemployment rate. There's still a decreasing manufacturing problem, and that's not even dealing with the massive demographic decline they're about to hit because they, like most of the developed world, have a demographic bomb that's going off now.
Right.
And so while I do see them as the most responsible state capitalist or capitalist power, and I mean that positively, and I do think they're a real socialist in China. That's not my point. I don't see that as a viable exportable model to the world, and they don't seem to either, actually, which I've pointed out. They're not making that a condition of like joining BRICS or anything. Like, BRICS is not the fifth international, people. Like, it's just not.
Yeah.
So if China has problems, they're just way less terminal than ours. And Europe's problems actually seem more terminal than ours, which is something that their power dependency. I mean, to me, whenever I'm like, oh, the US is turning into Argentina. Sorry, Argentina, I shouldn't insult you like that. But then I look at Britain, I'm like, well, Britain's doing that even faster than we are. And that's despite return of labor, government liberal. Doesn't matter. Corbynism doesn't matter. None of that's had any effect. The popular rhetoric around left populism increasing worldwide has had almost no policy effects anywhere. You can argue, it has in Brazil, kind of, but it's mostly doing developmental management. And in Mexico, it's doing responsible developmental management. Fine, sure, and true. But I don't know how long that's going to phase shift into, mid-century social democracy or anything. So taking this internationally, this profitability crisis seems real, and it's hard to get people to square because they are taking stock profits, which are not really profits in and of themselves. I mean, they can be, but stock profits as somehow indicative of a productive economy that is producing massive profits, and it's just corporate greed. And that just doesn't seem true if you actually look at the bottom line, except in this weird loop around NVIDIA chips and server farms and the AI thing, which does seem like it's about to blow up, and it will be massive when it does. But what do you think there?
It's gonna be really ugly when it does. Yeah. I mean, I think that like because the asset appreciation, stock profits, like capital gains, like the appreciation of the price of assets, like from the time you buy them to the time you sell them, it has become so central to just the way that everyone thinks about business vigor and wealth and profitability in general, because the stock market, it plays such an outsized role in like the political imagination in this country, and even among certainly Trump, it's always like one of the main things he's thinking about is the health of the market, and so I think it's kind of natural for people to kind of see that and just conclude that, well, look, it's going bananas. Like, profits have literally never been higher. Like the S&P hits a new record every 2 weeks or something, without distinguishing between, capital gains are one thing and profits that allow for the broader expansion of the international productive economy, are another. And then we can, of course, if we want to take the Marxian point of view, we can point out that, and in fact, the production of surplus value is something different from both of those, and it is at like a deeper level of abstraction. That in my book and in my work, I try to make the point. I try to show it's like analytical power, But yeah, I mean, it's very hard, and I also agree. Alami is a fantastic contemporary, Marxian theorist. I love his work on state capitalism. He and his co-authors, by the way, there's a few of them over there who are working in Europe, who are working on state capitalism right now, who are doing really great work. And yeah, it's very clear that we're dealing with this transnational or international shift into a stage of capitalism in which, national states are not only taking a more hands-on interventionist directly managerial approach to their national, formerly private economies, they're also increasingly taking larger government stakes in their economy, right?
The rise of sovereign wealth funds, right?
Yeah, sovereign wealth funds, or the Treasury and the Department of Defense here, right? Taking shares in the rare earths company, and in Intel, right? I think it was the Treasury that took a share in Intel, a big share in Intel a few weeks ago. And so even Trumpism again, as this generative historical force, just we're going to throw the neoliberal playbook out the window and just start buying companies with the government for their national strategic objectives, whatever, blah blah, however they rationalize it. But the point being is that they feel like they have nothing left to lose, right? Intel is a massive failure. Right, they've completely been left behind in the international semiconductor and manufacturing and AI and chip design race. They just have totally failed. And so the government is increasingly just whatever, we have to try to do something, right, to stay competitive in this space. Because you were saying, with the profitability, because it is increasingly difficult for these national governments to secure a vigorous expansion of the private capitalist economy in a way that would allow for some kind of broad, widely shared growth that would stabilize the country. Right, that's always first and foremost on their minds. Is sort of balancing the needs of accumulation versus the needs to stabilize the country. They're increasingly just throwing the rule book out the window. But also they're that's kind of a classical framing, right? The way that state theorists and Marxists thought about it in the 70s was there was, the capitalist state faces a trade-off between, fostering the accumulation of capital, removing the barriers to private investment and expansion, and maintaining their domestic legitimacy, right? Mm-hmm. Their political legitimacy as liberal democratic states. And it's increasingly evident with Trumpism, with not just Trumpism, but that is maybe the most visible example, that they're willing to just throw out the window the whole legitimacy part of that, right?
Right.
Securing, in some sort of liberal democratic sense of we're an administration that governs for the whole country, right? In the way that Bush or Reagan or anyone would have talked about it, that has been completely discarded, and it's now, they now are explicitly presenting themselves as a partisan occupying force, to the public,
right?
To their audience, but also to the audience of the people they hate on the liberal side,
right? And the people they just run over, which I do think leads people to this is why people assume this is going to be an authoritarian hyper Trump Reich, which I'm there are many problems, but I'm actually not really super worried about the Brumaire of an 80-year-old. Because the one thing I will say is, even amongst this petty proprietor even calling them petty proprietors is a little bit confusing. Private equity / some petty proprietors / whatever we see now, because it seems clear to me that once this Trumpist coalition is not maintained by Trump, these policies will probably be expanded by someone else, but the political coalition will immediately go to war with itself. Because this moment of exception cannot be maintained forever. That's always true for moments of exception. That's why they're moments of exception. And that's also, maybe we're beginning to see that on the left, in quotation marks, too, because it's very clear that the donor class is realizing that it can't, even though it's incentivized everyone to do nothing, it actually can't maintain that for very long and have any pretense of public legitimacy. Now, you've made this critique somewhat of very different politics from yours, but someone whose work on the politics is I like, Benjamin Studebaker, has talked about there is a worldwide general crisis of public legitimacy in any democracy on the planet. Like it is not just here. Part of that, I mean, he blames capital flight and a few other things that he doesn't think you can easily fix. Which is, by the way, why I think most of the left populism is also usually left nationalism, as Bernie Sanders has made very clear. I think that's doomed. I think even if it won, it would not work. And I wanted to get your take on that because, yeah, I mean, things like a Green New Deal and universal health care would be good. That's not something that I would even oppose if it happened. I don't think there's the actual capital basis or wealth for that. And the way that they do, like they seem to have been confused on this. And then I actually want to use this to pivot on the, like, in your most recent article for the Brooklyn Road, you talk about theoretical regressions, because I do think we've seen a ton of them, and I want to go into some of them on the actual left. But what do you make of that? I mean, would a left populist vision like that even be possible? It seems like they can't really do it in social democratic Europe, but what do you think?
I mean, this country like can't even, fix it can't even fix its roads and bridges and its public infrastructure. We can't get a functioning train system in our major cities. Like, we can't run a functional air traffic controller. So, the planes and helicopters are crashing, falling out of the sky.
And that was before Trump, by the way. It was getting worse before Trump.
Yeah. These are long-standing issues. We can't fund our, or at least we don't fund our education system at all.
Yeah,
nearly what it needs to be. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to envision how this would just be a matter of a voluntary change. Yeah, just a switch of will. Okay, we haven't been funding these things, now we will. In part because, I mean, there's a number of aspects to this we could get into. I think the suicide state piece kind of gets into it a little bit, but there was another old debate that used to be on the Marxist left around state theory in the 60s and 70s, which was around how transportation and education and public goods are an overhead cost ultimately for private capital,
right?
But they are one that the capitalists had historically been led to support because it led to better circulation of value, circulation of capital, the reproduction of labor power more effectively, right? More productive workforce. It led to a more overall, just a more productive and efficient economy to have these functional, dysfunctional infrastructure, right? For society, even if it was an overhead cost at the end of the day. And over the last 50 years, it's just been a progressive chipping away and dismantling of that whole network and that whole sense of of funding public infrastructure for the good of private accumulation. That I think it's not really a matter anymore of being yes, it's the Green New Deal. Obviously, that is we need. Of course, that's what we need, right? We need some kind of massive overhaul of the whole energy and urban and transportation infrastructure in a post-carbon economy. But it just clashes with this hard reality that the ruling class, right, the capitalist class, is no longer willing to fit the bill. To foot the bill for these kinds of social and environmental infrastructure costs. And we had this idea in the 2010s that, okay, if we elect Sanders and we elect AOC, we develop like a critical mass of elected representatives who share this point of view in Congress and with a sympathetic president, like, okay, yeah, maybe we could policy our way into this, right? But I think that I put it in other interviews, like policy is sort of over. In the sense of like, in that sense, right? Like we're going to be able to write some kind of, encompass like really ambitious, like Congress, right? And it's like, and its lawyers and its lobbyists and the NGOs are going to be able to collaborate on some kind of massive legislative overhaul like that. I just think the state, like you mentioned earlier, it's being actively dismantled. Congressional and executive leadership is just, the vision is not there. They can't see past, tomorrow, much less next quarter or like, 10 years down the road. That kind of long-term strategic vision has been completely demolished. And the ruling class just isn't interested in it, fundamentally, Right. And I think it would bankrupt them to undertake this kind of massive investment. And so it's kind of like we're in this, you could call it chicken and egg or a circular problematic, but it's like, if we talk about something like implementing the Green New Deal, it's like we're sort of already presupposing like a major rebalance of class power away from the capitalist class and towards, the massive laborers and workers and the working class. And that presupposes, right, like a coherent, like, recomposed working class, a class conscious working class, like one capable of acting in and for itself. And so, yeah, I think it's like, it brings up all of these questions around politics and strategy that I feel like we were kind of overlooking in the 2010s for the nice kind of like clean policy idea of it, right? And I don't want to say that like, the people who wrote about that, who were writing about the Green New Deal and those kinds of ideas had a kind of like Pollyanna-ish sense of what it was going to be. But I do think that model of like intervening and entering Congress and the executive in order to carry it out, like I think that ship has sailed. And yeah, it's I think that part of the idea is
but it
done.
might launch 1,000 Fettermans.
It is.
Like,
very much is.
Right. I mean, there's a couple parts of this I want to zoom in on, and then we'll pivot to the left theory ideology problem, right? But one of them is like, not only do I think it would bankrupt them in terms they don't have the profitability and actual profits to do it. Two, the left also doesn't recognize, and I hear this all the time. We're like, oh, with the amount we're spending on X, say the military, we could have universal health care in a week. And I'm like, for about a week. And also you are not factoring the downstream cost other than just the nominal monetary bill, because you don't fucking know what money really is. And when I critiqued your tariff piece, I agreed with 90% of it, but I said that, one of the things we have to be careful of is assuming, even though we measure this in monetary values, we aren't dealing with commodity-backed money or even simple credit money that Marx was writing about. And that's just a fact. But that has led people to believe that we could just print our way into if you were to look at like the most vulgar forms of modern monetary theory as a policy prescription, not as a description of the way fiat currency works. The idea is we could print our way to a jobs guarantee, and the ruling class would be okay with it because they're not getting taxed. And I was like, what do you think taxation is about? This is about power, and like even that. Like, so why would they ever do that? That would be giving up their power over the class. But in addition to that, confusing the expression for the thing, because even modern monetary theorists realize that what's actually at stake is production. If you actually really push on them, they know that.
They know it's what you said.
They know it's production, but they seem to think that liquidity is the only thing at hand for increasing production. But then I'm like, but for your stuff to work, it isn't just a way that'll be captured by investment capital. You're going to have state capacity planners on the web, which we didn't even see at Gosplan, to make sure you invest this correctly. And sorry, the Soviets couldn't do it, and they were objectively better at this than you. So I don't know what, how that was going to go, because I'm like, okay, so you want us to targetedly intervene through I want to say on healthcare. One, the people will bring up the Nordic and the British system is probably the most socialized in the world. And it is internally falling apart. The issues in Canada, which is still way more generous than the United States, but it always looks better because if the United States didn't exist, they'd have to invent it so that their own problems wouldn't be visible. But like provincial funding of National Health Service in Canada is becoming a crisis because they can't provincially keep it up with costs. I mean, that's a true thing. It's way more generous than what we're doing by leaps and bounds, but it is a real thing. And I hate to tell people, I've been to countries in Latin America that do have socialized medicine that you would not want. Mexico has socialized medicine. You have to bring your own needles, right? Like, and I'm not joking. And I don't say this to disparage Mexico. I love the country. It's just true. And most Americans don't know that. They just have, so they hear we could spend this amount of money and get this thing. And then the other thing they don't think about, and Gabriel Winant's work actually is helpful for this, is that the jobs complex that's been kind of keeping the cities alive is a privatized health industry that keeps the spouses of former blue collar production workers employed, which basically holds the entire city together. There's a reason why Chicago and Detroit and these areas have more these massive healthcare systems that are also not particularly integrated, and places in the Mountain West either don't have them or they have more integrated ones like we have here in Utah, because it wasn't the same kind of works project to fill up a deindustrial base, right? And I guess the last thing to look at before we get into this is like, and your work actually does touch on this, the idea that we're not productive is false. We're the second largest producer of manufactured goods on the planet. We sometimes get overtaken by the EU, aka Germany, but not recently. And yet that has not led to anything because of these, organic composition problems that you've talked about, Phil Neal's talked about, that have just made this developmental path not as possible.
Right.
But there are so many people after Occupy who are path dependent on this 2010s thinking, who I kind of think are being used, frankly, that don't want to deal with that. I guess maybe one more thing before we pivot is your point about the Sanders Workers Project. It's similar. I've actually made the point. It's perfectly circular. Support us to create national policies that would bring the workers' movement into being, but we need the workers' movement to exist so that you can bring us into office to do that.
Right.
Like what they're actually, like, just put it in very simple terms. That's what they're doing. That's what they've been advocating for 15 years. And I've had to argue with people in the right of the DSA and in the center of the DSA about this, where I'm like, okay, so if you guys are doing so well, you've created a bunch of union staffers. I know many of them personally, but the unions are still declining because, okay, you want to make a big deal about the UAW. That's in one of the most devastated economic fields in the United States. It's not like the auto industry has done very well since 2001. Actually, I mean, like maybe since the 70s, right? Like, so you're banking on a a renewed workerism in a field that's dying, and the UAW has been having to go like organize TAs to grow, and they haven't tried to do what you would think makes sense, to go down into like the other things related to the auto industry, like the ununionized service sector, the ununionized auto parts distributor sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why is those are franchised and can't easily be unionized in any significant sense. They're not in an industrial model, so you can't really do it. Public services are closer to an industrial model, although not really, but at least they involve massive amounts of people and singular institutions. So that's where you go, even though like that doesn't actually make sense from the purview of the UAW's jurisdiction or needs. Or like, how are you going to represent the interest of TAs and auto manufacturer workers? That doesn't make sense. And these just are not looked at because I think it really hurts any idea of what left populism could be. But I wanted to get your take on that and what you think, how that might relate to this theoretical regression.
Yeah, it's really it shouldn't be shocking, but I still feel surprised every time I see the Jacobin article arguing that workerist Sanders style populism still the way to go. We just got to get all the woke stuff out of it, right?
Right.
Non-DEI, and it's just like, guys, we tried this twice and it didn't work both times, and it might be time to move on. And all the contradictions you were describing and like the would-be base for this project is totally right on. Like it's UAW in particular, I know, has been having like a lot of, when you're organizing what remains of the industrial worker base and TAs and RAs and like lawyers, like all in the same, all in the same union. It's very difficult to form that into a coherent political subject. And you just don't see them very often reckoning or grappling with that. I think it's weird because there's this like doubling down on this vision in these parts of the left right now, even as we've been talking about throughout the conversation, the actual capacities of the state to like organize and manage, to envision something like this, never mind organize and manage it effectively in like a technocratic way, is just being sapped away by the day, and we
don't even have the skills for it anymore. I mean that literally, like, we don't know how to do it now.
Yeah. We wouldn't know where to start. And we have at the same time this concentration of power around the executive office, right? And I think the build out of ICE and Border Patrol, which is now like the 6th or 7th largest army in the world, or will be in a few years, by personnel and funding, and the tariffs, right, which are meant, at least in the way that they frame them, are meant to kind of replace in part the income that would be brought in from income taxes, particularly from corporate income taxes and the very wealthy. And indeed, like the tariffs have been bringing in like pretty significant revenue that is going to be difficult for the next regime, the next government, whoever it is, if there is another election, to just say, okay, we're not doing that anymore, right? Like this big slush fund from the tariff revenues is we're just going to give that away and stop doing it. So it feels like these massive institutional changes are being baked in, almost putting us on this trajectory for a more personalistic, like executive, like powerful executive, extremely weak Congress, extremely weak legislative branch, and that these trends are going to be continuing, regardless of what the next administration is that comes in, and that is being that's happening while we're seeing this stronger reinforced call for essentially just the 2010, Sanders style vision for nationalized everything, but without woke. And so, yeah, it's a weird paradox. And I think it's related to what I talk about in the Suicide State essay, which is concerned with sort of exactly this problem, right? Like in that essay, I sort of get at it through, with like Adam Tooze and Latour, these two figures, which I'm happy to chop it up about them if you like. But
I would like that, because Latour is not a figure that most people actually pay that much attention to anymore. I was forced to read him 20 years ago, but I actually do think he really profoundly affects a lot of left or quasi-left pundits. And Tooze, I'm going to say, is one of the best of that cohort. But the more I look at it, what he's advocating for, the more I'm deeply confused by how he can still advocate for it, even when he's right about so many other things.
Yeah.
And I think in a more, I think when I was talking about with MMT, I've seen this there too in dumber ways, where, and I've, some of the MNTers have gotten into Claire Mattai's book, but not really grokked that meant that the basis of their own work was tied into the same capital stabilization project of the early 20th century.
Exactly.
And that it's actually damning for them in a lot of big ways. Because my friends, Keynes was proffered as the answer to fascism as a way to manage this sector actually of the economy that's coming back in full force, and fascism was an attempt to manage that too. And I hate to say it, so was social democracy, and probably so was a lot of Marxist Leninism in the developing world. And I don't think anyone. I think people don't like that, because you're basically like, I'm foreclosing your options. But let's get into Tooze in specific, and then we can jump from there. So how did Latour and this kind of post-Marxist milieu of the 1970s to 1990s and actor network theory and all that, so if you're in deep humanities academia, actually still is a pretty big paradigm. How was that, a cover for this? I also think Baudrillard was too, by the way. I'm going to get to that as well, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Although I have a soft spot in my heart for Baudrillard.
No, I do too, because he's reacting to stupid leftists in France. So,
he's fun to read in the contemporary context of, like, all meaning breaking down and like nothing means anything anymore. But yeah, definitely he's a main figure there. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, so I think Tooze is an interesting figure because he's an interesting figure in a lot of ways, but he is both a very strident Keynesian, right, and he's heavily influenced by Latour. And those two things typically are at odds with each other, right? Like, because the Keynesian is the classic macro social scientist, envisioning the social whole, envisioning the economy as this, hydraulic, like, mechanism where you're pulling certain levers to affect certain variables, and you're modeling it out, and you're looking at the whole thing, right? Like, and you're predicting behavior in the way that it's going to work out in the future in order to optimize growth. And Latour, right, his whole project in a lot of ways is to cast doubt on that whole epistemological enterprise, right? Is to say that, look, as soon as you start modeling as soon as you claim to offer a model of the social whole that encompasses everything, or even the economy, right? You are essentially like writing out or sort of violently effacing the networks and the local interactions where meaning is made, and where people understand how people understand themselves to be acting, and how they understand the context in which they're acting. And that can never be captured in like the macro social scientist model, right? That's kind of like part of what Latour is about. And you see that coming out in Tooze, right? Because he's always thinking like a Keynesian, like, okay, like, how are the policy elites fucking up? Like, what could they do better? Like, how could they, manage the system more competently and effectively? What could the Democrats do to be more effective? as a governing political class and so on. But he's also always thinking about the sort of messy imbrications of institutions and agents within the institutions, and how they're like imbricated with each other in these really hybrid, messy ways, and how that always kind of like eludes that larger macro perspective in some way. Mm-hmm. And so that's the Latour moment, right? And you always sort of see those two things oscillating in what Tooze is saying, or usually, very often you do. But the funny thing is, right, like they both Keynes and Tooze, they take the 20th century like managerial state as either the standpoint from which they speak, which is what it was for Keynes and for Keynesians. They're speaking as basically state technocrats attempting to manage the capitalist economy competently, or the object of critique, right? That's how Latour thinks about it. That whole perspective of the seeing like a state, as James Scott famously put it, is mistaken and misleading for all these ways. But they both take that formation of the 20th century, the state that was built up across the course of the 20th century, the progressive managerial state, as their point of departure, right? As either object or standpoint. And as the kind of subtext, or not necessarily subtext, the theme, really, I feel like of our whole conversation today has been like how that managerial state is dissolving in all these ways, and how the technocratic expertise that it relies on is dissolving, how the institutions that make it up is dissolving, how the political class is becoming stupider, right, like by the day, and less capable of managing it effectively by the day. And all of it is rooted, right, like I argue in my work, right, in this declining vitality of not just the U.S. economy, but the international capitalist economy to generate the surplus value that allows the whole system, to all the countries and all the corporations, to rise together. It's decreasingly able to fulfill that function, and so that's why international politics and economic policy is breaking down into this like international knife fight, right, with tariff policy and trade sanctions and increasingly militarized relationships. And so that's why I think that's partly how to explain like Tooze's confusion, right? Like he's like, there's nothing more here, and so he's more and more interested in like China, right? You probably noticed over the last like year or something, he's become really fascinated with China and with everything that country is doing, especially on post-carbon energy build out, and he's really transfixed by it.
Although ignoring how much that China has failed to complete that. But go ahead.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. But he looks at
the number of times China has tried to get off coal and go back is, I think we have is
yeah. Yeah, they're saying now that they're aiming to be they have a milestone in like I think maybe 2030 or something. They're aiming for it to be like a very small portion of their energy production, but we'll see. Like you said, it's back and forth. But people like Tooze, they just look at the graphs, right, and they see the build out in the graphs, the lines going up, and they're like, holy shit. And I think I think that kind of like that palpable sense of uncertainty and confusion and just like lostness that you get in Tooze's writing now is because those two theoretical poles of his outlook, right, like Tooze and Keynes and Latour, are rooted in a state formation that is now on the way out. The state, like they have neither the capacity nor the will to administer national capitalism in the kind of classic like as it was in like the sort of Keynesian heroic era of the post-war period, when that was seen as like the main license for legitimacy, not just for the governing class but also for the capitalist economy. They're no longer interested in that whole problematic, and it's increasingly just turning into this familial and nepotistic war for spoils in this country at least. But yeah.
we have seen this before, but people don't like what it ends in. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
And
True.
the last time we saw it, there was a massive workers' movement, and there was counter forces in other parts of the world. I mean, China is a counter force in the sense that, like, if I was to say it was state capitalist attempting to transition to socialism, if I just take them at their word, I and by their word I mean Xi's word, not what their constitution says. I have to conclude that they are the more responsible state capitalists, but people who are looking at their throughput are ignoring some pretty significant issues that they've been having that, frankly, if Trump wasn't doing the wrecking ball that he was doing here, would have come up as major problems even sooner. So deflationary economy, private investment still being largely tied into private real estate valuations, despite land reforms that gave people the right to own their homes and whatnot, still leading to massive amounts of speculation that has been unstable. They are still having to slowly roll those that bank down. It's unclear if they're going to actually totally succeed in that. High levels of youth unemployment in a socialist managed economy. Increasing numbers of billionaires with internal political influence, and also rising internal Han nationalism, which Xi has tried to navigate both by incorporating and suppressing depending on the time, just like he did with other forms of neo-Maoism, although the Han nationalism isn't neo-Maoist. I'm not implying that it is. But that's how he handled neo-Maoism too, is like deal with Bo Xilai, but like also incorporate parts of the project. And I think this is largely because people don't really know that much about China, frankly. But they're also like, oh, it has massive legitimacy. And I'm like, well, it would, like, she has done things like finally reverse the underdevelopment of the Chinese countryside, which was terminal from Deng to Hu Jintao. He's done a lot of things. Like, similarly, when we talk about Steinbaum in Mexico, I mean, AMLO's led a pretty successful developmentalist policy that's going to hit hurdles, though, because it was based on integration with the United States. And being kind of the kind of trade point local, middle production manager between us and East Asia and Latin America. And that's collapsing. They're still being pretty profitable off of the internal economy because there's plenty of stuff to develop in Mexico. But once they hit that, you're going to have the same kind of problem that you had in Chile and Argentina. So there's
a ceiling there.
There's a ceiling there. And no one likes to hear about the ceilings. And I'm like, you could overcome these ceilings if you had an international socialist project, but you don't. So,
or if the rate of, if the organic composition of capital was not as high as it is.
Right. If you had a Butler and Jihad, but good luck on that. So, like, seriously, because I've had to tell people, like, if you want this smokestack socialism to work, you literally have to stop productivity technology, and no one's going to want to do that, including socialist states. And if you ever want to get out of a workerist paradigm, which I would assume socialists and communists want to, although that may be a bad assumption, although that, historically is why we exist.
That's who you ask,
yeah, well, those people didn't read the text. Anyway, depends on who you ask. If you ask Marx, the abolition of the class is part of the point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There are contradictions in there, even in Marx, but like, my point about that is just like, I don't see how you do that forever, which is also why I've seen, on the far left, you've seen stuff like Dominica Loserdo come up, which basically say that communism is just national developmentalism forever. like if you read his Hegel book, he's like, we shouldn't get rid of the state. And I'm like, well, that was a mistaken thing. It's empirically wrong. And I'm like, well, then you are saying that the actual, from the standpoint of classical Marxism, that class abolition is impossible. And even Lenin and even Stalin would have thought that was going too far.
Is he like a philosophy of right?
Yes, he that's his favorite Hegel text.
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
You know, and I'm just like, so the Marxist that's based off of the Hegel that Marx explicitly hated the most. Right. Yeah, and also basically sees the Prussian economy as the eternal answer to everything.
Mm-hmm. We just need that mixed constitutional monarchy.
Yeah. Right. So we need Bonapartism, but controlled by, I guess for him it's Bonapartism, but controlled by party apparatchiks.
Right.
You know, to which he would never say because he's a critic of Bonapartism too, but he has to deal with the fact that that's implied by his Hegel theory. He's dead now, so I can do whatever. But his popularity actually indicates to me that a lot of the left, a lot of the far left, also is in a theoretical regression mode. That like, oh, all we can do is make Dungism over again. I'm like, but okay, so what are you hoping for? That the developed parts of the world become so undeveloped you can rerun a developmentalist economy?
Right.
Like, that doesn't make sense. That's also circular. And it's weird and kind of accelerationist, even though you're not saying that. Like, to be fair to Lacerda, he just doesn't think the developed world is worth seeing, and we're going to do this in the developing world, except, you know, we're going to pretend that China isn't part of the developed world now. It's like, which is crazy to me.
Right.
So I guess, you know, you talked about also in your suicide state piece, which I would tell people, we didn't actually even talk about that much the heat wave piece on tariffs and the oligarchical piece in the baffler, but they're kind of implied in your suicide state piece anyway. That, I mean, Trumpism is an incontrovertibly contradictory movement that will have a limit. But the idea that you're going back to 20th century neoliberalism via abundance, or 2010s progressivism, which itself was nostalgia for the 60s. I think all those ways are closed. And I mean, they're hard closed. Yeah. Like it's not about political will anymore. It's also like, how are you going to build the technical capacity? You don't have time to do that. Why would you do that when you have all this technology? Like, what is even the purpose of that? You're actually trying to retrograde technological development, which as a socialist, it's kind of weird to advocate for. You know, maybe you think, and I kind of do, some of these technologies are just so world damaging, we're not going to be able to utilize them fully, or maybe not utilize them at all. But like it's still, that's a pretty big departure from historical socialism. I mean, I guess, what do you think comes out of this? I mean, I know that Phil Neal has been trying to work through the kind of communizer vision of that. I think it is necessarily both too specific and too vague. I always love Phil's work when he's doing analytics, but when he actually talks about the answer, I'm like, I don't see how we get there yet, man. Like I just don't. But so, what is your thinking right now?
Like politically, basically, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I think that the whole project, of the 2010s that we've been talking about, the project of Sanders' social democracy, whatever we want to describe it as, is that way is closed. I think that now we have to get more creative, I think, in the way that we're thinking about what a workers' movement is. Like, because if we talk, if we talk to, your average like Jacobin reader or Sanders enjoyer or whatever, like who's on board with the old like left populist ideas, like they'll also be like, of course we support, that's what we're all after, right? Is like a workers' movement. But like it's now we're down now to a question of like, I think, strategy and strategic decisions that have to be made about what kind of movement we want and how we build it. And I'm kind of, I mean, my analysis or my take on part of the failure of the 2010s moment was, that came out of, like, built up out of the wreckage of the 2008 meltdown, and then to Occupy, and then, the uprisings in Ferguson and Baltimore, and then all of that kind of culminating in that energy in the electoral campaigns of 2016 and 2020. I think that those attempts, like those campaigns and that kind of activism, was essentially, it was kind of like it was like tree branches without roots. It was it was mainly electoral. It was plugged into. It was very run and dominated by the NGO kind of, like, party, like Democrat nexus, right? And a lot of the leadership of at least the unions that were progressive enough to want to get on board with that project, which of course wasn't even most of them. And that just turned out to not, right, to not hold the political sway in the way that we thought it might. And, I'm speaking as someone who supported those efforts, despite being on kind of like the radical left since the early late 2000s at least. And so I think we have to talk about what it means to build the foundation of that workers' movement. Right now, the work I'm doing and the way I'm thinking about it is focusing on working class culture and civil society, right? I think there is a class composition problem that we have to figure out before we can talk meaningfully about a working class movement, right? Like the fact that Sanders tried that twice nationally and lost twice meant that it wasn't truly a working class movement, like it didn't have the support of the vast majority of the class. And so what would it do? What would a genuine, class conscious movement look like? I think that there is a prior problem of class composition that we have to figure out what it looks like at the level of local networks, everyday life, cultural activities, stuff like mutual aid, service, service mutualism, educational resources, like building out the kind of civil society fabric, if you like, of the soil of what could be a conscious class, right? That, like, sort of cultivates our identity and our self-understanding as workers, right? Regardless of if we work in the some part of the service economy or some, like highly automated factory, like auto assembly factory in like South Carolina, or we're in the communities that are being devastated by ICE right now, right? Like, it's like, how do we build the bridges across these constituencies of the class, these fractions of the class that still are very divided and separated from each other, but are like, the unity has to be essential if there's going to be anything like class consciousness, And I think that right now, in my own assessment, that's pointing towards civil society organizing that then points towards some kind of organizational question in the distance. Like, what is the form of organization that we're looking for? Is it party? Is it commune? Is it, is it some kind of dual power thing? Like, I think all these questions are kind of in flux right now. And like, we on the kind of, radical left, who are pushing for a like powerful working class like project, should be thinking creatively about the kinds of organization that it would take, or that would be adequate to this moment. Because I tend to agree with you. Like, most of not all of it, but a lot of the ideological baggage and organizational like methods we've inherited from the 20th century may no longer apply, in the present. And so it's time for something new, and that's what I'm committed to trying to figure out right now.
For me, I'm on a similar page where I think that ironically, civil society is dying. So weirdly, that's where we need to focus on. But the focus on civil society will actually put us in a direct conflict with the state. Just straight up. Like, even though it doesn't seem like it would, because we're like the people not advocating for electoral work and not advocating for this, that, and the other. But I think if you start actually rebuilding consciousness, you start reskilling people. The reason why it would be a direct conflict with the state is it would be a direct conflict with those who fund the state now. And I mean, as we're talking about this, I mean, quite literally, the government shut down, and you have billionaires donating money to specific parts of the government, despite the fact that it's in blatant violation of both statute and federal law. I mean, this is end of Roman Republic shit. But I also think we're not going to be to make it just about the American Republic is to miss the point. I mean, like it's a much larger problem, and I think you're right, because we need that. People keep asking me, I'm a union rep. I'm literally a union rep. I'm elected. But I basically tell people most of these unions are not even in the capacity to represent their membership well, even if they want to, much less currently lead a political movement, as they are declining, bereft of funds and being attacked legislatively, not just in the United States. Right. This is where a lot of people are like, oh, there's a big thing in America for people to go, oh, well, there's, it's just the America doesn't have a left. And I'm like, well, our stuff is more decayed, sure, but these trends are everywhere. Yeah. And in fact, the fact that we were the hegemon for so long and are now quickly not becoming that anymore, maybe that's why you're seeing it more terminal here. But if you look around, even the countries that you're using as models, you see this over and over again. Or you see market liberalization. I mean, one of the things people don't talk about is Cuba was forced to market liberalize by China recently, and that's what a lot of those seemingly anti-communist protests were actually about in Cuba after COVID. It wasn't and stuff like that. People just don't know that, and for good reasons. I guess one last quick question about an interesting point of fracture is it seems very clearly that not just the U.S. but the entire world wants to start renationalizing its media apparatus. You see this particularly in the U.K., which is basically trying to shut off, trying to do its own version of a pathetic, sad version of the Great Firewall in China. But as a person who knew people in China, the Great Firewall actually doesn't really work. It doesn't actually keep everybody off of
not entirely, right? Yeah.
Right. No. Elites get into the Western internet all the time. And I started thinking about this, and I'm like, to me, this is part of the same end game with this economic nationalism. It's okay, so they want media nationalism. And I think even a lot of the left kind of wants this. You've seen it in Canada too, and in continental Europe. But it's not really possible to do without breaking the trade networks that these states still need. And I think that's going to be a major problem going forward. And I'm wondering if that's where a lot of our internationalism might emerge, because it's clear that we've gotten used to having access to, I'm a teacher. I complain about how neoliberalism and whatever the fuck this is, which is not so much neoliberalism, makes my students stupider and stupider. But they do have more access to world knowledge than I did in high school in the 20th century.
Of course.
Absolutely. And they know it's going away. They are aware it's going away. And I wonder what that means, if that and trying to serve the functions that were served by other institutions in civil society is where our points of leverage are, which admittedly I will admit, I'm going to just say this is a Hail Mary pass Like it kind of really is.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Like I feel like it's a spaghetti against the wall time period. But I'm increasingly finding that like left populists and stuff are actually in my way for doing this. Like they're actively kind of a problem now.
Yeah.
And these are people that I considered allies for, a long time. So anyway, where can people find more of your work, Jamie?
You can find me on the good old Bluesky. I'm not on X, formerly known as Twitter, much anymore these days. But yeah, you can find me on Bluesky. Check out my book, In Game: Economic Nationalism, Global Decline. And yeah, that's where you can usually. I write a lot for the Brooklyn Rail. You can find a lot of my stuff on there as well.
All right. Yeah, I put a plug on the Brooklyn Rail. It's one of the magazines that I find myself reading more and more, like Negations, Strange Matters, Heatwave, Cosmonaut to some degree, and actually the New Left Review has gotten weirdly interesting again, which is
they have their cycles at New Left Review.
Yeah. I mean, even when I think they're wrong right now, I'm like, well, they're wrong in a way that actually indicates something major. Like,
I'm supposed to be writing something for them actually, as we speak, but things have been a little distracting here lately, so I haven't.
Yeah, I wonder what could possibly be going on in Chicago.
Well, hopefully. Anyway, so keep an eye out for that. Maybe sometime early-ish next year. Hopefully. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Really good talking to you, man.
Good talking to you too.